Chapter 23, Respiratory Physiology, Screencast 3. The focus of this screencast will be the control of ventilation. The first thing we have to look at, though, is the Respiratory Control Center, and the Respiratory Control Center can be found in two areas of the brain. Primarily, it's going to be in the medulla, and also there is a pontine respiratory center within the pons. So what we want to take a look at here is the sensory input that is making its way into the respiratory control center, but also kind of note that the output is all to skeletal muscle. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. The first set of receptors that I want to talk about are chemoreceptors, and these are probably the most important. And if we look at the central chemoreceptors, they are found once again within the medulla, and they are monitoring hydrogen ion in the cerebrospinal fluid. So when there is an increase in hydrogen ion, this will result in an increase in ventilation. So please keep in mind that the primary stimulus for ventilation is an increase in carbon dioxide. Now, we'll talk about these a little bit later because I want to talk about the relationship between CO2 and hydrogen ion. But the central chemoreceptors here are basically monitoring hydrogen ion. If we look at the peripheral chemoreceptors, they are located within the peripheral nervous system, the carotid bodies, and also the aortic arch. And they are going to be sensitive to levels of carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and oxygen. Now, if we look at the output, we can see that the output is all skeletal muscle, and that has been discussed previously. But there is also two other types of input that are going into the respiratory control center, and that is going to be baroreceptors and irritant receptors that are detecting pressure and irritants. And then we have proprioceptors. We will go back to these along the way. Now, when we look at quiet breathing, inspiration begins with ventral respiratory group inspiratory neurons that fire spontaneously. These signals are sent from the ventral respiratory group to nerve pathways, exciting skeletal muscles for about 2 seconds. The diaphragm and external intercostals contract, causing air to flow in. Quiet expiration occurs when ventral respiratory groups are inhibited, and signals from inspiratory neurons are relayed to ventral respiratory group expiratory neurons. Expiratory neurons send inhibitory signals back. Signals no longer sent to inspiratory muscles for about 3 seconds. The diaphragm and external intercostals relax, causing air to flow out. Now, respiration rate for normal quiet breathing, known as eupnea, is on the average of anywhere from 12 to 15 breaths per minute. What the pontine respiratory centers do, they actually facilitate smooth transition between inspiration and expiration. So they will send signals to the maxillary respiratory center, but they can be damaged by damage to the pons may cause erratic breathing or a loss of that transition between inhalation and exhalation. Apnea is a term used to describe the absence of breathing. This can occur voluntarily, and a good example is breath holding. Swallowing is also another example. It could be drug-induced, and this can be a significant problem. If we're talking about respiratory distress, apnea can also be caused by neurological disease or trauma. Now, many of you may know someone that has sleep apnea. And sleep apnea is temporary cessation of breathing during sleep. Generally, this can be treated with CPAP. And what that is a continuous positive airway pressure machine. And you may know some individuals that actually require or use these either to help with their sleep apnea, or sometimes they are used in individuals that have very severe snoring. Now, the first thing that we have to look at are a number of reflexes that alter breathing rate and depth. As noted previously, we're going to talk first about the chemoreceptors that alter breathing by sending signals to respiratory control centers. Ventilation increases in response to central chemoreceptors detecting increase in hydrogen concentration of the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, this is an important thing to keep in mind here. What is causing the increase in hydrogen ion? And it is an increase in CO2. So if we look at central chemoreceptors, they are responding directly to hydrogen ion, but indirectly to CO2 because it is the increase in CO2 that is ultimately responsible for the increase in hydrogen ion in the cerebrospinal fluid. Peripheral chemoreceptors, as noted, they're located within the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies, and they are going to be detecting either increases in blood hydrogen ion, an increase in PCO2, or a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen. Keep in mind that the peripheral chemoreceptors are the only receptors that are actually sensitive to changes in oxygen. Now, generally, an increase in ventilation is to expel more CO2 and bringing conditions back to normal. You may hear me use the term to blow off CO2. Ventilation decreases if chemoreceptors detect decreases in hydrogen ion or the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Now, as I noted, the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood is the most important stimulus affecting breathing. When you raise the partial pressure of carbon dioxide by just 5 millimeters, this will actually cause a doubling in the rate of ventilation. CO2 fluctuations influence sensitive central chemoreceptors, as we've adjusted, and it is all about the formation of carbonic acid. Blood PO2 is not a sensitive regulator of breathing. If we look at blood levels of oxygen, they're relatively much higher than those for carbon dioxide. And if we want to look at what will impact ventilation with respect to oxygen, it would require basically going from 95 millimeters to 60 millimeters before this decrease in oxygen has any impact on ventilation that is independent of changes in CO2. Now, this is an interesting situation when we look at what is known as hypoxic drive. We have already addressed the fact that the primary stimulus for increasing ventilation is going to be the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Hypoxic drive is a situation when the partial pressure of oxygen becomes the stimulus for breathing. This will occur in individuals such as emphysema with a decreased ability to exhale carbon dioxide. In these individuals, carbon dioxide levels are in the blood and they remain elevated for a very long period. So what this is indicating is that the chemoreceptors become less sensitive to the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So now the only receptors that are left are going to be those that actually detect a decrease in oxygen, and those are going to be the peripheral chemoreceptors. Now, administering oxygen in these individuals can elevate the partial pressure of oxygen and actually interfere with the person's ability to breathe on their own. Other reflexes that have an impact on breathing rate and depth could be other receptors. There are joint and muscle proprioceptors that are stimulated by body movement, so they will signal the respiratory center to increase breathing depth. Baroreceptors that are found within the visceral pleura and the smooth muscle of bronchioles will send signals to respiratory center when overstretched. This initiates an inhalation reflex to shut off inspiration, and it protects against overinflation. There are also irritant receptors, and these irritant receptors can actually initiate the sneeze reflex or the cough reflex. These would be exaggerated intake of breath followed by closure of larynx, contraction of the abdominal muscles, and an abrupt opening of the vocal cords, an explosive blast of air due to the contraction of the abdominal muscles. There also is the role of higher brain centers, because we know when someone tells us to start breathing in and out, we can actually do that. When we look at the hypothalamus can actually increase breathing rate if body is warm. This is the impact it has on the respiratory center. The limbic system can actually alter breathing rate in response to emotions. This also will be through the respiratory center. Now, when we look at voluntary changes in breathing patterns, these will be accomplished by the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex. This actually bypasses the respiratory center and stimulates the lower motor neurons directly, resulting in ventilation that is controlled. Now, if we look at another component that I think is important, we have put an emphasis on the somatic nervous system. We really do not address the autonomic nervous system to a great degree when we're talking about the respiratory system. What will be impacted by the autonomic nervous system will be the smooth muscle that we find within the bronchioles and glands. So these will be innervated by axons of lower motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system and ultimately controlled by the autonomic brainstem nuclei. Keep in mind the emphasis has been put on skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is innervated by lower motor neurons of the somatic nervous system, controlled by the brainstem autonomic nuclei, cerebral cortex, and the somatic nervous system. So one of the things that is different about this particular system is there's both reflexive and conscious control of breathing.